The rope was moving. Medicsecond Velesh had been watching the biometric board for 3 hours, and he knew what stillness looked like on that display. He had watched 11 prior summit attempts on the Karath Spire, watched the colored pulse signatures of Vorathi climbers, Thessan guides, Gravathi researchers, all of them moving through the upper bands with the careful predictability of beings who understood exactly how close to dying they were prepared to get. The rope did not move on that board. The rope was a fixed line. Fixed lines did not move. The human signal was moving. Not drifting, not oscillating with wind load, moving with intention, up and to the right, at a pace that made no sense given that the storm front had closed the upper face 17 minutes ago. The fixed line that expedition guide Ren Okafor had clipped to the spire's northeast buttress at 6,200 meters before the weather window slammed shut was, according to the wall display and Velesh's own sensors, ascending. Okafor, he said into the radio. Okafor, respond. Static. The carrier tone was alive, but the storm was eating everything above 6,000 meters with the specific efficiency of a Karath weather system, which was a phrase Velesh had used in 3 incident reports, and which he had run out of ways to make sound less final. He looked at the second biometric trace on the board. Expedition Client Thesak, a 4-armed Vorathi engineer attempting the northeast buttress route, had stopped moving 40 minutes ago, pinned on a ledge at 6,340 meters when his crampon anchor failed on black ice. His left lower limb registered as injured. His oxygen reserve, which had been at 60% when the storm hit, was now at 22%, and declining at the rate of a being in physical distress who was cold and frightened, and consuming his supply faster than calm would allow. Velesh had already run the calculation. At current depletion rate, Thesak had less than 90 minutes of breathable reserves. The storm would not clear in 90 minutes. The authorized recovery window for weather closures above the 6,000-meter band was 4 hours minimum. In theory, Thesak could not be reached. In theory, Ren Okafor was waiting at the fixed-line anchor station at 5,900 meters, clipped in and sheltering, until the storm passed. The biometric trace continued its deliberate upward movement. "He is still going up," said Base Commander Orvhin from across the tent, not looking up from his own display. His voice had the flatness of someone stating a fact they had not yet categorized as possible. "Yes," Velesh said. "The storm has closed the face." "Yes." Orvhin was silent for a moment. He was Vorathi, which meant his threat assessment instincts were finely calibrated and perpetually engaged, and the look he was giving the biometric display was the look of an instinct that had found something it could not file. "He knows Thesak's reserve is running," he said finally. It was not a question. "He has the same telemetry we do." Then he calculated this. Velesh said nothing. He watched the pulse signature move. The signal was consistent. That was what held his attention, not the fact of movement, but the quality of it. No pauses for wind loading, no irregular gaps suggesting a missed placement or a moment of indecision. Just the pace of someone who had already decided the pace and was executing it. He had watched 15 human climbers on the Spire across 3 expedition seasons, and had never seen a biometric trace behave quite like this one. What Ren had calculated, climbing with his face pressed into the rock to stay out of the lateral wind load, was this. The ledge where Thesak was pinned sat 12 meters above the anchor station, and 12 meters on a fixed line in normal conditions was 8 minutes of careful movement. In these conditions, with visibility reduced to the ice directly in front of his face, and the wind coming in lateral bursts that hit the exposed face like a physical argument, it was closer to 25. 25 minutes up, 25 minutes helping Thesak rig for a descent, 25 minutes down, managing a 4-armed being with a compromised lower limb on a fixed line in a storm. 75 minutes, Thesak had 90. He had not communicated this calculation to base camp, because the radio was mostly useless above 6,000 in a storm system, and because the calculation did not require their input. It required his movement. The rock face on the northeast buttress of the Karath Spire was not the most difficult terrain Ren had worked on. He had done his certification circuit on Ivorhole Reach at 18, where the upper walls were overhanging, and the belays were ice placements that the instructors described as provisional and meant. He had done 3 guided ascents on the cradle before his license was extended to Class 15 environments. The spire's northeast buttress was sustained but not technical. The holds existed, the line was established, the anchor placements were sound. The challenge was not the rock. The challenge was the wind, which was now gusting in excess of 90 kilometers per hour in the lateral bursts, and the temperature, which had dropped to the range that Vorathi expedition medical literature described as unsurvivable beyond 40 minutes of unprotected exposure, and the fact that his visibility was effectively the circle of rock illuminated by his headlamp at a range of about 1 meter. He moved through this the way he moved through all hostile terrain, one placement at a time, never committing his weight to a hold until he had tested it, reading the gusts by their pressure change rather than by any visual cue he didn't have. His hands were cold enough that sensation in his fingertips had become approximate rather than precise, which meant he was working by geometry and force instead of feel. He noted this and adjusted his technique accordingly, not pulling back, but finding a different route to the same result. He moved faster between placements to limit contact time, spending heat on motion rather than losing it to stone. At the 15-minute mark, he found the ledge. Thesak was there. One of his 4 arms had been pressed flat against the rock face, anchoring himself, and when Ren's headlamp swept across him, he turned toward the light with the slow deliberateness of someone in early cold-induced cognitive impairment. His upper eyes, the pair Vorathi used for close-range work, were open and tracking, which was the relevant information. "Guide," Thesak said. His translator rendered the word in Galactic Common through the earpiece in Ren's helmet, slightly distorted by the storm static. "I've got you," Ren said. He was already clipping into the ledge anchor, running his hands over Thesak's harness by touch, assessing the anchor failure site. The right lower anchor had pulled. The left was holding barely, a single point bearing Thesak's full weight plus wind load, the cam seated in a crack that the ice had filled and partially heaved over the last several hours. He could see the movement in it when a gust hit. He did not mention this to Thesak. The descent rig took 12 minutes to build. He had the gear for it, a mechanical advantage system that could manage Thesak's weight and his own on a single line, the kind of setup that took 4 minutes to build in controlled conditions and 12 when your hands were cold, and the wind was trying to pull the components out of your grip, and you were doing it one-handed because the other hand was keeping you attached to the face. He talked Thesak through the steps, because talking through the steps kept Thesak's attention on the task and away from the oxygen reserve display on his wrist unit, which was at 16% and dropping. The left anchor held through the rigging. It failed when Ren weighted the descent line. He had been expecting something to go wrong. In the Karath Spire accident records, which he had reviewed during the weather window before the storm hit, the category of incident he was currently managing had a pattern. The second anchor failure came when the system transitioned from static to dynamic load, because the cam was never fully seated, and the jerk of the first movement was enough to walk it out of the crack. He had built against this contingency as well as he could, which meant he had his backup anchor clipped and ready, and when the left cam blew, he had approximately 0.4 seconds to catch the load on the backup, before the backup's force multiplication would exceed its own rated limit. He caught it in 0.3 seconds, by feel, because that was what the training had been for. The system held. Thesak had not registered the anchor failure, because the load transfer had been smooth enough, and because Ren had not reacted to it in any way that a compromised Vorathi in early cognitive decline could read as distress. "Starting descent," Ren said. His voice was level. They went down. Velesh watched the biometric board. The two pulse signatures had merged at 6,340 meters for 27 minutes. Now they were descending together, at a rate that was slower than standard descent protocol but consistent and controlled. He tracked them through the dead zone of the storm layer, where his sensors lost granularity and the traces became approximate, positions within 20 meters rather than within 3. He tracked them through the lower storm band, where the wind load on the fixed line would be highest. He tracked them through the final exposed pitch above the anchor station at 5,900 meters, where the headlamps of the recovery team he had pre-staged were now visible as faint smears through the precipitation on the tent's viewport. The two signatures reached 5,900 meters. They continued descending. "He is not stopping at the anchor station," Orvhin said. "He is bringing Thesak all the way down," Velesh said. "The anchor station is not a medical facility." Orvhin looked at him. "That is another 400 vertical meters in this." "Yes." Orvhin went back to watching the board. The Vorathi had a particular quality of silence for situations they found philosophically difficult to categorize, and Velesh recognized it. He had felt something similar 3 years ago, when a guide had carried a client off a failed summit push by simply not stopping. That guide had been human too. He had not thought about that until now. The two signatures reached base camp at the 5,500-meter staging area 2 hours and 14 minutes after Ren Okafor had begun ascending into the closed weather system. Velesh was outside in the storm before the tent seal had fully cycled, his emergency kit already open, recovery team flanking him. The headlamps resolved into two figures. Thesak, four-armed and slow-moving, being managed down the last fixed section by a figure behind him who was moving with a deliberateness that Velesh recognized as controlled impairment. The gait of someone who had spent their reserves and was operating on procedure now, each step managed rather than felt. Thesak's oxygen reserve was at 4%. Ren Okafor's hands, when Velesh pulled the outer gloves away, had the deep pallor of significant cold injury, 6 fingers compromised, possibly 2 more, an assessment that would require time and warmth he didn't have at 5,500 meters in a storm. He noted it and moved on. Ren was upright, eyes tracking correctly. He could assess damage later. He asked Ren if he had any other injuries. Ren thought about this for a moment, in the specific way of someone running an internal inventory that was taking slightly longer than it should because the cold had reached the processing. Then he said, "Nothing structural. I am cold." That was a technically accurate statement. Velesh filed it and moved his team to managing Thesak, who was the more urgent case, and had Ren taken into the medical tent by his junior assistant who understood the instruction without being told what it meant. The debrief happened 4 hours later, when the storm had begun to ease its upper bands, and the medical tent had reached a temperature that made coherent conversation possible. Velesh sat across a folding table from Orvhin, and they both looked at the incident log, which was waiting for a summary entry. Thesak was stable. His oxygen deprivation had been brief, and his cold injury to the lower limb was repairable. He would descend to the base settlement in the morning under escort. Ren Okafor had 8 frost-damaged fingers, 2 of which were assessed as significant and would require specialist treatment at a lower-altitude medical facility. He was asleep in the medical tent under his 3rd heat blanket. "What do I write?" Orvhin said. It was not entirely a question. Velesh looked at the log. The incident classification field had a drop-down. He had been staring at it for 20 minutes. He calculated that Thesak would run out of oxygen before the storm cleared, he said finally. So he went up in a closed weather system, rigged a descent for a four-armed injured client on a failed anchor, brought him down 400 meters of fixed line in 90-kilometer gusts, and walked into camp on his own feet with 8 compromised fingers. "Why?" Orvhan said. "Because Thesak was still alive," Ren said, from the entrance to the tent. He was wearing 2 heat blankets over his base layer, and his hands were wrapped in the bulky thermal compression wraps that Velesh's kit used for cold injury. He had clearly been awake and listening for longer than either of them had realized. His voice was level. He was not angry. He was simply stating what had seemed to him like the obvious answer to the question. "He was at 16%, Ren said. "That is not 0. 16% means he had time. If I left, he ran out of time. If I went up, there was a window." He looked at the incident log on the table between them. "I was the only person on the mountain who could make the window." He went back inside the tent. Velesh looked at the incident log for a moment longer. Then he wrote the summary, which took 3 attempts because the classification system did not have a category for what had happened, and in the end he filed it under the closest available heading, and added a note that said the classification would require a revision. Orvhan read the note. He did not suggest changes. He signed the incident report and set it down. Outside the tent, the Karath Spire was not visible through the storm. It would be visible in the morning, when the weather cleared, its northeast buttress catching the early light, the lines of fixed rope barely visible at that distance, the whole apparatus of the mountain sitting quiet, and enormous and indifferent to everything that had happened on its face the previous night. Velesh thought about the 16% window. He thought about the 0.3 seconds. He did not have a word, in any language he spoke fluently, for a being who looked at a number like 16% and saw not a reason to stay back but a reason to move. He was not sure the word existed in the galactic common vocabulary. He was not sure it had needed to exist before. He sat down and finished his report and let the storm pass.